Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Wentworth Woodhouse. It's absolutely packed tonight. It's brilliant to see so many over here. Thank you so much for coming. Tonight, a very special speaker. Joan is a volunteer at Wentworth Woodhouse. She's been researching the history of the family and the house and the area for more years than she cares to remember. So she tells me, so I'm not going to tell you exactly how many that is.
I was very young when I started.
She was very young when she began, yeah. Tonight is, I believe, a first to talk about Thomas Watson-Wentworth. I'm certainly going to learn loads tonight. I will pass you over now to Joan Jones. Thank you.
Tried to get my glasses on with this contraption. Can you hear reasonably? Yep, jolly good. Thomas Watson-Wentworth. He became the first Marquis of Rockingham in 1746, only 4 years before he died. But I'll refer to him as the first Marquis because he had all sorts of honours. He was Baron of this and Viscount and Earl and so on, but it'll just get too confusing. So here is our man. He was an ambitious builder. He built this place. He was a garden enthusiast. He was a conscientious land manager, and he was a family man. As Steve said, this is a relatively new area of interest for me, but I've come across all sorts of bits of detail that I thought I'd like to share with you this evening. And inevitably there are gaps that needing to be filled and more research needing to be done. But this year, 2023, is exactly 300 years since Thomas Watson-Wentworth inherited the Wentworth estates. He arrived here as a 2-year-old with his parents from Northamptonshire. So like all politicians who have a 5-point plan, I've got 5 questions I'm going to try and answer this evening. Why does someone from Northamptonshire inherit the Wentworth estates? What does he build and why? What does he develop for his park and gardens? And what sort of a family man was he? What were his family concerns? And finally, the people that he supported, his charity work and his charity giving. So here we are. There's the chappie here on the right-hand side as a young man, and he looks as if he's actually pointing to the Palladian mansion that he actually built. A number of documents that I've looked at are in Sheffield City Archives in the Wentworth Woodhouse Muniments. The top left is a fantastic document. It's written on vellum and it's called the Rent Roll Book. And it's part of it, obviously, are the rentals, income and so on. But the most fascinating bit I find is the bit that he called Many Remarks and Observations. And it was his sort of journal. And the first Marquis wrote with his quill all sorts of details about his building works, about his family, and so on and so forth. A wonderful document. And on the right-hand side, another book that I've looked at fairly recently is from the Marquis of Steward, William Corston, and it's called his Cash Book. And the illustration is just part of one of the pages where he's writing down every item of expenditure on a day-to-day basis from 1724 to 1732. Bottom left is just an example of just one of the hundreds of letters written by the first Marquis and by his wife, Lady Mary. Now, I've hardly dipped into those, and they're on microfilm in the City Archives. So there's something more to be done. And the bottom right one is just an extract, because when he died in 1750, 7 appraisers went round the mansion, room by room, itemizing every item of furniture and all the fittings. There's another document itemizing all the pictures, and another one that's just going round every drawer and every cupboard and looking at all the deeds and manuscripts and how much cash he'd got. He'd got £1,448 in cash in his lordship's closet. And apparently, according to the Bank of England, inflation calculator, that's about £36,000 in today's money. But there we go. I've put this up just to sort of get you into the picture to see how the inheritance passed. So top right, the second Earl of Strafford, when he died without children, he passed the whole of the estates, and I say estates plural, because they've got 90,000 acres in Ireland, as well as South Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, and Northamptonshire. And he passed it all to his sister's third son, who was also a Thomas Watson. And he was from Rockingham. I'll tell you about him in a minute. And then that went from the first Thomas Watson, who became Thomas Watson-Wentworth, to his son, another Thomas, just to confuse you. And they had 10 children. And the youngest son, Charles, was who inherited, who became the second Marquis of Rockingham. I'll test you on all this later. And you can just see that the eldest daughter, Anne, marries a Fitzwilliam. And when Charles died without children, that's when the Fitzwilliams came to be here. Two portraits here. So we're just stepping back a little bit before we get on to our man. So on the left-hand side is William, the second Earl of Strafford, with his two sisters. And the elder of the two is Anne, and she's the one who married Edward Watson of Rockingham. And on the top right, the two sisters a little bit later on. Last year in September time, I visited Rockingham Castle again. If you haven't been, put it on your list. It's fantastic. And on the wall there was this portrait of the two sisters. And I said, "What do you think Arabella is passing to Anne?" And the guide said she didn't know. But she said one visitor had suggested it looked like a Jaffa cake. It actually does. When William dies, the second Earl of Strafford, the chap here, his honour as he was often called, had this fantastic memorial built in York Minster. So that's to the second Earl of Strafford. And at the bottom of the inscription it says, "He, having no issue, made the Honourable Thomas Watson heir of his estates in England and Ireland." And I presume that Thomas Watson had that put up in York Minster just in case anybody was there to question that he was the rightful owner. And here he is. This is Thomas Watson. Part of the will stipulated that he add Wentworth to his name. So that's where he becomes Thomas Watson Wentworth. And is known in many, many documents as either His Honour or His Honour Wentworth. And he looks pretty splendid with that wig, don't you think? Top two are Rockingham Castle. First of all, an 18th century engraving, and then an aerial view of what it looks like today. And it really is fantastic. And they've got beautiful grounds and nice woodland walks and so on and so forth. There's a lovely church, which is going down towards Rockingham village, and an ice house and so on. But the village, it's almost like Wentworth village. It's a street village, but it's got that lovely ironstone, stonework, shall we say, for the buildings. And a lot of it is thatched. But the doors and window frames are in what we call Wentworth green. They're all that sort of bottle green shade. The bottom illustration is a property that was bought by His Honour. He married an Alice Proby, and then in 1693 he buys Harrodon Hall in Northamptonshire. So at that point, I assume, he's married, he's bought himself a new family home. He owns about 2,000 acres in Northamptonshire, and I suspect he was set up his life, in Northamptonshire. And then 2 years later, he finds he's inherited Wentworth Woodhouse and all the estates. So I guess it might have been a bit of a surprise. And people say, why? Why did he inherit? Perhaps, he was the nephew. Perhaps he just liked him. Who knows? So what does he inherit? will inherit a mansion, possibly built by the first Earl of Strafford. Now, some people dispute that this is actually, Wentworth's house, as it was called at that time. But according to Joseph Hunter, in his book on South Yorkshire, he's got this in the book as an etching, which he says was made from an old oil painting in the house when he was doing his book in 1830. We may never know, but nevertheless, he did inherit quite a large mansion. But who expected to inherit? Another Thomas Wentworth. Now you're getting confused. This chap was based in Yorkshire. In fact, his family were from Wakefield, and he was a diplomat and a soldier. So why did he think he should inherit? Well, he'd got the family name of Wentworth. He was descended through the male line. He'd got Yorkshire interests, and apparently the second Earl of Strafford owed his father money, so he thought, he might get his money back in some shape or form. And this sort of rivalry then ensued between the two families. Thomas Watson-Wentworth, our man, was set to be an upstart and an outsider. Anyway, Thomas Wentworth from Wakefield decides to buy a neighbouring property. He buys Stainborough Hall, and he starts to expand it and build new wings, both in the Baroque and later the Palladian. And he renames it Wentworth Castle, more or less to say, it's not at Wentworth, it's not a castle, but he was just saying, I can do what you can do, basically. And his brother Peter has these wonderful lines. Apparently, when he was shown the plans for the Baroque wing, Peter said to his brother, he said, "This should make his great honour burst with envy, and his little honour pine and die." So he wasn't very keen, was he? Our chap, this is our man, our Thomas Watson-Wentworth, who became the first Marquis. They seem a little bit unperturbed by all this rivalry and just sort of carry on. His honour goes about expanding the estate and consolidating it, and is a very conscientious land manager, and does really well to pass on to his only son, Thomas, who looks absolutely splendid with this waistcoat, don't you think? And he marries a lady, as we've said, called Lady Mary Finch. He's marrying into another aristocratic family. And when he got married in 1716, his father and mother decide to leave Wentworth and go and live at Houghton Roberts in their mansion there. And they said they gave to him the chief house. So he's living here with his wife from 1716. And when his honour dies in 1723, again, another fantastic memorial in York Minster, and this is put up by our man, our Thomas. So, what does he inherit? These expanded, well-managed estates, and I've said in South Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, Northamptonshire, and in Ireland, 90,000 acres, largely in County Wicklow. And what's his rental income in 1723? Well, in South Yorkshire, it's about £4,500. Malton and North Yorkshire, about 2,000. Northamptonshire, about 3,000. And Ireland, £6,500, totaling about 16,000. And we're talking about, 2.7 million in today's money. So a fantastic rental income every year, and no doubt increasing, if inflation's anything to go by. But in addition to that, they'd got fantastic deciduous woodlands, and they were managing them. And they were getting wood from the coppice for all sorts of things, from barrel making to besom making and for charcoal making. And also they were selling the timber trees for the major building projects. Trinity College in Dublin has got the most wonderful roof structure from timber trees on the Wentworth estates in Ireland. They were selling to shipbuilders and so on. and an incredible amount of money came from their managed woodlands. So don't let anybody tell you that this house was built on coal, because it wasn't actually built from rental incomes, from farms, and from woodland management. Later on, the income from coal certainly played a part, but at this stage not. In fact, there was just one colliery at the time he inherited, Low Wood in Elsica, with about 10 men working as miners. I love this portrait. It's largely the Finch family, but Thomas is on it as well. So Thomas and Mary are on the right-hand side, and there's some children, a couple of nursemaids, some of Mary's sisters, two brothers, a John and a Henry, who were both Whig politicians. And it's here, it's the PR of the day, the portrait. They're just telling everybody, they're on the up, they're aspirational. And it's showing their family connections, some of their allegiances to aristocratic families joining together, and an honour. Can you see Thomas with his sash and his big badge? He's dead proud, because in 1723 he was made a knight of the Order of the Bath, and that was made an honour from the king. And apparently it's called the Order of the Bath because apparently in the old times gone by, shall we say, part of the ceremony was that you had to be bathed, to be cleansed, as it were, before you received the honour. What does he do? He starts to build, and he builds big, and he builds impressive. And he starts, first of all, on what we might call the Baroque front, sometimes called the West Front or the Garden Front, and it's even called the Back Front, as you probably know. And he probably builds about 1724, shortly after he'd inherited. I like to think that he'd discussed it with his father beforehand, and they might have made plans and preparations before, but we may never know. But they conceived what they called the masking of the old house in places. And those of you who know the building well will know that there's still evidence of an earlier building that you can still see. The drawing across it is by a man called John Setrington, and he's responsible for this illustration. And we're never sure exactly who the architect was. John Setrington has been mentioned. The resident master mason was a Ralph Tunnicliffe, and he was here until he died in the middle of the 1730s. But all the names have been mentioned, this William Etty, a William Thornton, a William Wakefield. I think it helped if you were called William, obviously. But nevertheless, they set about building in brick and in stone. And the cash book tells us how many bricks between 1724 and 1732. I totted them up to just over 3 million bricks. And there are references on practically every page to people actually turning the clay, as they called it, or in some cases actually buying kilns or numbers of bricks. Don't know where the brick kilns were, whether there was some here. They kept referring to the Griesbrook people, i.e. Griesborough. So it was obviously quite a task to be turning the clay as well. And stone from a number of places, as you can see. Houghton, Morley Common, Skulls Close, Hoyland Common, Huber and Roche Abbey. The little extract that I've put on says, the brickmakers for making stone. Sorry, the bottom one. What does it say? Timothy Clark for bringing stones from Houghton to Woodhouse. And then there's payments for people dressing slate and for lintels. This is that lovely engraving that's on the outside of a T and a W. And briefly, there were money being paid for putty and glazing. Robert Watson, gosh, did he make some nails? He's on practically every page for making nails. You've got Robert Littlewood for casting and laying lead on the new wing. Jonathan Woodcock for carrying deal from Doncaster to Woodhouse. And the Griesbrook men, again for carriage of deal from Doncaster. So they're using a number of different timbers. The deal, of course, was like a softer wood from pine, possibly for indoor things. And then there's all sorts of things like painting in the dining room and my lady's bedchamber. Samuel Rose and Son were paid for plastering, and the Rose family worked here for a number of generations. Come across them later, ornate plasterers. And plaster was brought from Mar. Wainscoting was installed in the new dining room. And I love this one. The upholsterer was paid 14 shillings for dressing feathers. What a job. £16, 15 shillings for upholstery work. So perhaps the chairs were a bit more comfortable than yours. The Marquis said that in 1928, the garden front was finished. That's the exterior. They carried on working on the interiors. Now, this nice portrait is again from Rockingham Castle. My good, what a size badge. So there he is with his Knight of the Order of the Bath. I've put, and was he proud? And over the windows of the Baroque front, they've actually engraved in stone, at least on 2 occasions, that actual motif of the Knight of the Order of the Bath. And the motto was Tria Juncta in Uno, 3 joined in 1, supposedly to do with England, Ireland and Scotland being joined together. This is a bit of a digression, but I couldn't resist it. Looking at the carvings on the Baroque front, and I thought over the doorway it might have been the griffin, but no, it looked more like a parrot, don't you think? And the 2 griffins are fantastic, aren't they, really? They were emblems from from the Wentworths, then to the Marquises, and then to the Fitzwilliams, adopted by all of them. It's this herald that's supposed to depict strength and leadership. As you probably know, the back portion was the lion, and the front was the eagle with its wings and its feathered breast and its of an eagle. And the 2 sort of towers have just been regilded, if you know. Got a few bits about the chapel interior, which was finished about 1734, and Tunnicliffe was paid for its completion. And in 1736, the writes, prayers were said in the new chapel for the first time. And the chapel was finished in oak with its 18th century chandelier and Venetian window. And the inventory is really nice because it itemizes 2 joint brass candlesticks, a pair of snuffers, 21 other brass candlesticks on sockets, and then a bit of comfort, 12 red velvet cushions, 12 red long cushions of stuffed damask for the seats, 2 iron stands for charcoal, you'd need to keep warm, and then the Bibles and prayer books. And one visitor, a travel writer called Richard Polk, said that the family attended prayers between 10 and 11. And then he starts on another task. Almost before the Baroque wing was finished, decided to start on this Palladium, the east front, and it was described as a Whig palace. That was where his political leanings were. And he writes, the Marquis, that the carving of the arms of the great front were then done after he'd done the pillared hall and the portico. And you'll know the motto, Mea Gloria Fides. My faith is my glory. And to be quite honest, I didn't realise until last year when we visited Rockingham Castle, that's the motto of the Watson family. And as you go in their great hall, it's painted on a beam, in the ceiling. And as I say, it looks quite splendid. So Palladium by then was becoming the national style and this badge of Whig ideology. The Earl of Burlington, who was known as the Architect Earl, was its chief advocate. And one of his protégés was Henry Flitcroft, and he took over at Wentworth when Ralph Tunnicliffe died, and is credited with a revised design for the Palladian front. And it's believed to have been the central portion, at least, on a house at Wanstead House in Essex. And then a Frank Pickerton becomes the resident master builder. And then the Marquis writes in 1739, the great portico was built, which, considering the size of the stones and the quality of carving, was the greatest piece of building I had ever done in 1 year. 1 year! I mean, it's fantastic, isn't it? Looking at the inventories, you can get a little bit of a clue as to what the interiors were like, or at least some of them. And the old gallery, which you know well, it itemizes 2 fireplaces, marble, oak and mahogany tables, 6 mahogany settees, 35 chairs, 2 carpets and partition hangings. And there's also an inventory listing 44 pictures that were on the wall in 1750. So it must have been quite a task going round room by room looking at everything. I'm afraid I quite like this one. This is again from the detail is from the 1750 inventory. And every room they went in, the first thing they write about is the fireplace, the fire grate, fire shovels and tongs and fenders and so on. And then they itemize 1 billiard table, balls and sticks, quite like that, a mahogany card table, and then chimney pieces and often mirrors, to reflect candlelight and so on. But just look at all the stuff they must have had on the walls. 12 blunderbusses, 8 cut muskets, 60 muskets, 108 bayonets, 74 pistols, etc., etc. Now, I've got to thank David and Beth for finding this in Sheffield Archives. 1748, there were details of a lot of the ornate plastering that was being done at that time. And the itemised lists were from William Perrott and Joseph Rose, and these were the ornate plasterers. And one of them just said that about £128 for 736 yards of cove decoration in the drawing room. And it says with octagon panels carved and flowers at 3 and 6pence a yard. And I wondered if this was the ceiling that is now in the room we call the Van Dyck room. I have looked, it's got 8 sides to these little bits of motif, but we don't know. In the dining room, I'll not go through every bit on here, but again, it's the fire grate and all the surroundings. It's the looking glasses, marble tables, mahogany tables. Mahogany was the wood to have if you could afford it. And all sorts of beautiful sideboards, 2 marble sideboards set in niches. This is the room that we now call the lower drawing room, and a set of red silk window hangings, 2 wood gilt eagles for stands for candlesticks, and 1 mahogany dumb waiter with 3 heights. I think that was more like a trolley than anything. A bedroom, just as an example, Clifford's lodgings, again, the fire grate, the mirrors and so on. And then I think the light red, if you get about halfway down, it says the room hung with red velvet. 1 pair of bedsteads with red velvet hangings lined with red silk. A set of red silk window hangings and cushions. 2 mattresses, 1 feather bed, etc., etc. So sounds quite plush. I hope it was warm as well. And the wonderful, wonderful sort of grand, saloon, the Marble Saloon. And if you can see at the top, I've just written down, it was the in thing, of course, at that time for the younger sons to go on the grand tour of Europe. And Charles, the youngest son, set off first of all in 1745, and he goes on the grand tour, and he's asked by his parents not to be too extravagant. Then his mum writes to him, "For God's sake, write your best hand and get a better pen." And his father says he couldn't read his writing even with spectacles. Now, the first tour he went with his tutor, a Mr. Quorn. But his family decided he was having too many amusements and not enough education, so they brought him home. But he goes again on another occasion a few years later with the instructions of buying some articles for the for the house. And he comes back with, not exactly comes back with, has sent back, should I say, 8 6-foot-high marble statues for niches, furniture of yellow sienna marble, books, paintings, a marble table, and a harpsichord. And in his letter, he said they wondered how they'd get them all home. It's words to that effect. But he was also having a good time because he'd got money in his pocket, and apparently he was buying himself silk stockings, a snuff box, ruffles, a waistcoat, and a muff. And he was travelling extensively in France and Italy and round and about, and he met many ladies and did lots of socialising, which resulted in him needing 2 months with a doctor in Padua because of his socialising. I say no more. The library here at Wentworth was well known for its fantastic collection of books and manuscripts, so much so that the Reverend Samuel Wesley and his son John come to visit in 1733, and they're allowed to consult the library. And John is asked if he'd like to preach in Wentworth Church on the Sunday, which was quite open-minded, bearing in mind that he was introducing, the Methodism brand of Christianity. The travel writer talks about this fantastic collection, and he also mentions an orrery, which was a clockwork model of the solar system, which sounds quite fun, and also globes and telescopes, and he said, everything that is curious to astronomy and geometry. And I can't not just add a few extra rooms here from the inventory, the dairy, the laundry with a mangle, saddon box irons, and winter hedge, which was a clothes horse. And then numerous other rooms from slaughterhouses and pastry rooms and a feather room, of course, and cupboards full of every kind of glass you can imagine, and crockery and pots and pans, including copper kettles with lamps and stands to them, quote, coffee pots and teapots and the like. And then lots of closets and necessary closets, some with close stool pans. Nice. And then the cellars, 9 of them, with everything you can imagine. And a quart, of course, is about a litre bottle, isn't it? Just under. So they've got Lisbon wine and port and claret and Madeira and Burgundy, champagne, brandy, whisky bar, Irish whiskey, and rum, and even water cellars. Well, it says 1 with 2 filtering stones, basins, and 1 large lead cistern. And the last bit on this section, the 1746 accounts show that a Mr. Wright they were purchasing from, and he was part of Richard Wright and Edward Elwick of Wakefield, and he was supplying fine mahogany furniture, both to Thomas and to his son Charles. And by 1750, the Marquis writes that he'd calculated that it spent about £90,000 on the house and furnishings. We're talking about 15 million. Not only were they doing the house, but the gardens and the parkland. This is a nice engraving of about 1728, and it's showing the gardens and the slightly just around it some of the parkland. You can actually just see, when you look at the original, you can see some deer and deer shed, and the park wall, and the ha-ha separating the gardens from the park, so the deer don't eat all your prize shrubs. This shows the garden in a little bit more detail. Can you see those 4 obelisks? They're now round the Rockingham Monument in the park. And here you've got the straight lines, the beautiful knot gardens, the parterres, the little groves, and they even had a bowling green. On the right-hand side, you might just be able to make it out where they were being paid, in this case, a John Swift for a pair of bowls for the rolling house in the garden. Very elaborate, with the Baroque building sort of facing us. And they even had a mount in the garden, a constructed hill with a steep zigzaggy path going up to this tower on the top. And it was said to be strewn with rocks and planted with firs to resemble a mountain. Daniel Defoe said it was 100 feet high, which seems pretty high to me, but who knows. The top illustration is a lovely little map that's in Sheffield Archives, sort of like a watercolour plan, and you can see the zigzaggy path marked on it. And the bottom illustration is more of a 3D look at it by Chris Broughton, and it was in Patrick Ayres' book that he published recently, but rather fun. Understandably, they were paying many gardeners for working in the park and in the gardens, and payments were made to mowers, scythers, cutters of grass and haymakers. No lawnmowers then. You either used cattle and sheep or you used people with scythes. A little bit later, there's a list in 1768 when there were 30 gardeners mentioned, including 6 women. I hope the women weren't doing the weeding. The Marquis refers to an obelisk in Lee Wood, the Needle's Eye, in 1728. It makes reference to the ice house being built, and later on there are accounts of it being thatched on a few occasions. And back to the drawing that shows on the right-hand side, Morley Pond, which was being constructed between 1726 and 1737. Imagine that task, people moving and wheeling earth around to make the pond. And across the middle, you might just be able to make out a whole series of fish ponds. And guess what? The Marquis liked his fish, particularly gold and silver fish. And at the top, it says, the same year I brought down a number of Chinese gold and silver fish to try to propagate them in Yorkshire. And he was obviously successful. 1746 is talking about his large carp and good tench. And, he says, the Chinese fish bred, and several young ones appeared very healthful. And then again, he talks about in the middle the size of them, 3 inches in length and proportionally in breadth, and he bred several hundred. And 1749, he bred several hundred Chinese gold and silver fish and gave some to the Duke of Kingston, Earl of Strafford, perhaps they were friends then, Roland Wynne of Nostell, and Earl Fitzwilliam. They were also building the terrace, 1735. There's a saying that he's making one of the finest terraces in England, for 'twill be 1,500 feet long. At one end it terminates in a fine rotunda of the Ionic order, and at the other end a bastion. And the Ionic temple has just been restored with its 10 Ionic columns encircling Hercules. And Hercules was this classical god, and he played a significant role in Whig political culture and was set to be a Whig hero. And here Hercules inside the temple is dressed in the skin of a Nemean lion and wielding a club to try to slay a mythical beast. And the lion's golden skin was said to be impervious to attack. And of course, the terrace, it was for your exercise, to take your guests for a walk, and also to say, you know, I own all this land via my parkland. And the Marquis was keen on the garden, and he was growing pineapples. Now, Britain was set to be in the grip of pineapple fever in the 1730s. I guess that's only if you're in the, aristocracy. But by 1740, Thomas writes in his journal that he'd got growing to great perfection, and that he could as many as 200 in a year. How did they keep them? Well, they did glass, but the pots were sunk into old tan bark. Now, part of the process down, they're taking the bark off the trunks, and the bark was crushed and used by tanneries to make leather supple. And when it ceased to be used, it was then sold on to kitchen gardens, for this particular purpose. And apparently it would keep of pineapples at about 75 or 80 degrees. So not a bad system. According to Richard Pocock, they were also growing watermelons and even bananas, which is quite fantastic. He also notes in his journal, 1737, the new menagerie was taken in. And a year later, the pavilion and greenhouse at the upper end of the menagerie were all then built. I've superimposed the photographs onto part of this old watercolour plan. You might just be able to make out on the right-hand side, just by the little patch of green, which was a bit of lawned area, where the greenhouse and pavilion were built. And they also had skittle grounds, which is quite nice. Now, the menagerie early on, I suspect, was more like an aviary from the accounts that we have. Later on, in the 19th century, they had 30-odd species of animals and about 60-odd species of birds throughout about 150 years or more. And Arthur Young describes the menagerie in 1768 when he visited, and he said, just by this Ionic temple is the menagerie in front of the greenhouse, containing a prodigious number of foreign birds, particularly golden pencil pheasants, cockatoos, doves, etc. He says the greenhouse is very spacious, and behind it a neat, agreeable room for drinking tea. And the greenhouse is the building that was altered in the early 19th century and is now what we call the Camellia House, which is being restored at the moment. And the pavilion, as it was called, it was the tea house around the back of it. But also, he goes on to say, Arthur Young, that they also had canary, which were housed in a light Chinese building. And they said they were kept alive in winter by means of hot walls at the back of the building and an open network of compartments in front. And they were building Hoover Stand. There's a letter from the first Marquis, and he's writing to Charles, and he calls him, "My dear son," and he signs it off, "Your very affectionate father, Rockingham." 1746. He says, "I have had Mr. Flitcroft here and fixed the plan of a pyramid for Hoover Hill, which is to be begun next summer. It is to rise 70 foot, no room, only a staircase to carry you to the top. It is to be triangular, and 20 foot broad at the top, the base 40 foot, so diminishes as it rises. And that same year, he also sends to the king, King George II, some grapes that were being grown at Wentworth. And he said, the king, he did eat them the day after he received the news of the Duke's victory over the rebels in Scotland. So we're talking about the Duke of Cumberland and the Jacobean rebellion. And shortly afterwards, Hobestand was built. Fantastic shaped building, as you know. And the inscription again is showing his allegiance to King George and also, his gratitude for being made a marquis in a few years earlier, in 1746. It was completed about 1748. Incidentally, I have an ancestor, Thomas Salkeld, and in the 19th century, one of his jobs was to paint all the doors and window frames and the railings round the top of Hobestand. There are also payments in this cash book for what was called vermin, or what they considered to be vermin at that time. And payments were being made for hawks' heads, jays, crows, rats and rats' tails, a heron, owls, kestrels, a buzzard, and then this one, to the mould-warp catcher for 8 dozen of moulds, 8 shillings. So, of course, they're moles. Plenty around us if we look today, aren't there? And then the bit I've copied from the cash book, W. Charlton for 2 fulmards. To fulmards. James Cooper for a weasel. Jonathan Froggatt for killing 6 crows, a weasel, and 2 gleeds. But what are fulmards and gleeds? And I found in an old West Riding dialect dictionary that fulmards was a dialect word for polecats, hence the illustration. But gleeds, red kite. And I thought, gleedless, the place name. It means a clearing in an otherwise well-wooded country frequented by red kites. I should have known that. I've listened to Mel talking about so many place names in South Yorkshire. Another mystery is what's called the house in the wood. Which wood? Which house? Bit of a clue. In August 1750, this Richard Pocock writes, I went with them to my lady's wood, where there is a little house in which a bachelor might live. We walked round the wood, drank tea, and dined in the wood. And then he went on to say that the wood is the improvement of the Marchioness and has several winding walks. My lady's wood is what's now Rockingham Wood, and for about a century it was called Lady Rockingham Wood. And it was acquired, not necessarily as complete woodland, but from Griesborough Common at the enclosures. Thomas, the first Marquis, acquired about 200 acres of Griesborough Common. And it appears that Lady Mary was very much instrumental in altering the design and perhaps creating this woodland. And I'm not sure whether this is what it is marked on this Burdett's map of 1791. If you can work out the shaded bit, which is Wentworth Park, and the lakes going across and the house in the north. And sort of to the south, there's a woodland here marked in sort of darker shading with a little sort of circular piece on it and what look like walks. And the bit sticking out at the edge is Skulls Coppice. A little bit later, Arthur Young describes this house in the wood. It says it's on a small hill of shaven grass. Sounds quite nice. And there's this little house. There's a house for repasts in hot weather. And he describes the dining room with its white marble chimney piece and bow window. And then he talks about a little drawing room hung with India paper, a large closet with bookcases, and kitchen and other offices beneath. The inventory of 1750 again talks about the house in the wood and itemises all the furniture and fittings room by room, and mentions in particular this Little India room. Now, apparently, India wallpaper or whatever, it's not necessarily Indian as so much as Southeast Asian or Oriental in its design, but it sounds quite pleasant, with a fire grate, a chimney looking glass, 2 mahogany square tables, 8 India chairs and worked silk cushions. So again, it's that sort of Oriental flavour to the room, and then a passage and a pantry and a kitchen with all sorts of accoutrements for refreshments. When Daniel Defoe visited, he described honeysuckle, roses and flowering shrubs planted around the house in the wood. There's also references to my wife's farm. This is Lady Mary, and she designed apparently her own new farmhouse. Not exactly sure where it was, but in a letter of 1746, he's describing the fact that she's got this, or she's creating this, what's thought to be more of a hobby farm rather than a sort of model farm. And again, there are all sorts of lists of cattle and sheep and turkey and fowl and so on that she's purchasing. And then another mystery here, ruffs and reeves. Now, they're wading birds, and I thought they were buying them for the aviary. Apparently not, because if you read on from Pocock's description, he says, among the game, they have ruffs and rees, as he calls them, caught in the fens of Lincolnshire. They're nourished with rice to fatten them, and are a delicate food that are. Mary's obviously proud of her farm, and she writes to Thomas, and again, I like the way she refers to him. It's all this polite society. She calls him, my dearest dear. Don't think anybody's written to me calling me my dearest dear. And she signs off by saying, I am my dearest's most dutiful and affectionate, Moulton, as she was then. And this is a bit of a letter. She says, Sir R. Wynne is with me, and I am so proud of all my farming projects that we are just getting on horseback to view them all, and I don't doubt of his approbation. And Sir R. Wynne, of course, is Roland Wynne of Nostell Priory. By 1744, the Marquis writes that the park was 9 miles in circumference, and by then included Scoles Coppice, which they'd purchased earlier. And his loose sheets in this journal that he wrote, there were 2 very, very detailed schemes that he wrote out how to manage the deciduous woodlands in South Yorkshire. And there are 2 schemes, both of 21 years rotation. And if you coppice a tree, a deciduous tree, down to ground level, of course, it grows again. And it's, cut and come again, literally. And there were woods were divided into compartments, and each compartment would be cut to ground level every 20 odd years. Some trees were marked up and left as standards, as they were called. They were the timber trees that might not be felled until they were 60 or 80 years old. But this was the fantastic income earner, and at the end of it he puts, to make a considerable profit. And again he writes, and so begin the circle again, i.e. you could keep going and cutting and so on. And estate workers were being paid for marking and felling. So you'd be marking up the ones that you were leaving, felling others, of course. And for charcoal making, obviously very, very important at that time. And they mentioned all sorts of woodcutters, wood colliers, i.e. charcoal makers, and bark peelers, taking the bark off for the tanneries. And lastly, in this particular section, the Moulton estate was bought by the Marquis's father, His Honour, in 1713, and he buys the Moulton itself and a large area of land around. And partly that was so that his son, Thomas, could become an MP for Malton from 1715 to 27. And in 1714, the first Marquis buys this building, which is now the Talbot Hotel, and also commissioned for a town hall and funded improvements to make the River Derwent navigable as far as Malton. He also bought, in 1741, he buys 4 Grosvenor Square in London as his London townhouse. You had to have your London townhouse, of course. Pays about £5,000 and has that refurbished as well. Back to his family. Thomas and Mary have 10 children. And we mustn't forget Lady Mary and her role in the household. She was obviously accomplished. She was responsible for the servants and the day-to-day supervising of the household, especially when Thomas was in London. And she was responsible for the family's health and well-being. There was the constant worry about their own health and the health of their children. And as we'll find in a minute, sadly, 5 of them died. She was expected to create and administer her own prescriptions, as she called them. Some of them were quite horrific. She was also involved, as indicated in her letters. She seems to have discussed politics with her husband. She was involved in furnishing the home, in the design of the park and its landscape, and in meeting and entertaining visitors and guests, and running her farm, and living on a building site. You think about all that was going on all the time. She also followed this 18th century sort of tradition, shall we say, in the polite society of taking tea. And so she had a number of tea houses. And obviously must have been well known because there was a book written in 1730 by a Thomas Short called A Dissertation Upon Tea. 118 pages about the properties of tea and how it might cure many an ailment. So I hope you've all had a cuppa tonight. The ladies, or the girls of the family, as I said, the eldest had married William, the 3rd Earl Fitzwilliam. Mary, the first Mary, dies when she's only 2 years old. Then the men name another child. It always seems strange, doesn't it? Another Mary. She married a John Milbank. Charlotte remained unmarried, but Henrietta, she ran off with the footman, William Sturgeon, and caused quite a scandal at the time. I've just noticed some of the honours that Thomas received. And as to the boys, well, Daniel, he died at about 6 years old. There was just one record I found of them buying him some red Morocco shoes when he was about 5. Thomas, who was born about 1720, there was a party to celebrate his 13th birthday and also the near completion of the Baroque mansion. And his father recorded the details of about 1,000 guests of, he says, neighbouring gentlemen and tenants. 225 dishes, everything you can imagine, including boar's heads in sauce, and plenty of alcohol to wash it all down with. There's this letter from George Phipps, who was an agent for the 1st Earl of Strafford of Wentworth Castle, the rivalry bit, and he's criticising the party in a letter that he sends to the 1st Earl of Strafford, and he says, they used deal tables and benches, as in the tents at Boughton Fair. So, cheaper wood, basically. They ate off wooden trenchers. They drank from horns, saying my lord did the same. The punch was strong, being the cheapest liquor, and the party was a troublesome, noisy thing. So it's really bitchy, isn't it? And sadly, the first Marquis has to record that too melancholy a thing happened. A poor man died as supposed by a fall in the courtyard, being in liquor. And sadly, a year later, Thomas was aged 14 when he was in Leiden in the Netherlands, and he died of smallpox. A tragedy occurred in 1732 when a fire broke out in the mansion. And the Marquis writes, the kindling of the coal in the foundation behind the chimney, says, where it smothered till it catched the joists and rise up the wainscot. The floors had to be pulled up, and then in his hand, and the furniture torn down. God's providence be praised that it happened in the daytime, and was immediately discovered by his goodness at a time when there were near 200 people at hand to assist in getting water, etc. So it was averted, thank goodness, with not too much damage. Back to the family, William had 2 accidents when he was quite a young lad, which the Marquis records in the journal. He said, he fell into the basin in the garden when nobody but a boy was by, who providentially pulled him out. He had probably been drowned, being very young. And he hastily shut a door, and a large picture which hung over it fell down with that violence as to shatter the frame to pieces, and by God's providence again, fell over the child, so he remained unhurt between the door and the picture. At first he had this vision of the frame being sort of round his neck, but sadly he too died at only 11 years old, after what the Marquis said was a feverish illness of about a month. By now, the youngest son, Charles, is the only surviving son, and they're obviously desperate for him to remain healthy and live to be an adult in order to inherit what his father and mother were creating for him. And the top bit, we're getting on a bit with time, so I'll just briefly say that they were very concerned about smallpox. The whole nation were. 25% of sufferers died, and it might cause scarring, and it might cause blindness. And the top letter is saying that the girls have the smallpox in the most gentle manner, thank goodness. They were all inoculated, by the way. And Lady Mary's letters to her husband, she's often referring to Charles's health. Poor lad, he doesn't seem to have been very well. But bear in mind this first one is a teenager, and she writes about his loss of appetite, and he was being hot and lazy, apparently didn't want to get out of bed. You think, he's a teenager. But then she talked about her cures. She was giving him a gentle vomit an hour and salt drafts. And then she writes to her husband that he soon recovered. I don't blame him. Then on other occasions, she wrote about his boils, his eruptions, bleeding him with leeches and giving him viper broth. Poor lad. There was an enormous panic when he ran off to join the Duke of Cumberland's army when he was only 15 to fight the Jacobites, but fortunately he returned unharmed. And then just a few more cash payments that I quite liked. They were paying people. They had a lot of shoes, by the way. I don't know who was making them, but they're also buying shoes. They were paying people for knitting stockings, for buckskin gloves, muffs, ribbons, garters, muslin handkerchiefs, and silver buttons. They bought a bag to put periwigs in, and they got some splendid wigs, as you know. For comfits for master, they were like sugared almonds, and 20 marbles for one of the boys. It's nice to think of them playing marbles, perhaps in here. A few extra food items were listed: honey, black cherries, apricots, mulberries, lemons and oranges, tea and coffee, walnuts, trout, cod, oysters and oyster knives, butter, cheese, Bristol water, and even a basket of larks. Not be much meat on them, would they? They were paying for sweeping chimneys, 50 stones of soap, wax candles, chamber pots, and for curing 2 men who were lamed working at Wentworth House, £3 3s. And I mentioned his charity giving. There were monthly payments to the 12 hospitalers or hospital people. That's in the almshouses. And they were buying shoes for them. They were they were supporting children's education, paying for teachers. They were buying clothes and coals and inks. Poor kids that got to wear leather bodices for the charity children. 15 gross of coat and waistcoat buttons. Take buttons. They were also paying William Handley for hats for the charity children at the Barrow, i.e. Barrow School, which was down by the almshouses. I love this one. For Molly Lawton stays and Tommy Portack's breeches, 7 2d. And he gave to people on St. Thomas's Day every year. This was a tradition. It was the 21st of December, and it was traditional for poorer people to visit the house of rich neighbours, shall we say, begging for food and something for the Christmas period. And this was something that was institutionalised by the Fitzwilliams in the 19th century. St. Thomas's Day, Collet Monday, all their outdoor workers lined up, and they were given money, 6pence, and a piece of beef or a piece of bacon. But it was nice to think that it had started, certainly by the time that the first Marquis was here. And he also has a record of giving to a poor woman at the gates, 6pence, to 2 seamen from Virginia. Did they get from Virginia to Wentworth? And they only got 6pence. Finally, some entertainments and trips. There were trips to London. They paid the coachman, the postilion, and horses were paid £13, 13 3d. You often wonder how they worked it out, don't you? They were going to Bristol, Malton, Harrowden, and Your Honour from Northampton to Woodhouse, 6 days. Hope it didn't take them 6 days. And there were payments to attend Penistone races, Barnsley races, expenses at the Cutler's Feast. And on family birthdays, they were paying for the Wentworth Ringers and Rotherham music. And I like to think that when they were paying 8pence for some music and 6pence to a fiddler, that they might have had a good dance as well. So in summary then, the family were following the 18th century pattern for large landowners by building to impress and to show their status. This house was a powerhouse. It was the headquarters from which their estates were managed. It was also a showcase demonstrating their wealth through the contents of the house, trophies, coats of arms, pictures and books, scientific equipment, sculpture galleries, their designed landscape with its temples and lakes and tea houses. They were showing that they were cultured through the fashions of the day. They were incorporating Oriental designs, buying mahogany furniture, hosting tea ceremonies. In short, the home and its parkland were symbols of wealth and power and privilege. But they did seem, I think, to be quite a loving and caring family who respected their workforce and supported all sorts of charities. They were supporting schools and scholars and churches and almshouses. Thomas dies when he's only 57, but I think you'll agree he left quite a legacy. And he wrote these words for his son, giving him advice, saying, if you lay out your money in improving your seat, land, gardens, etc., you beautify the country and do the work ordered by God himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, John. It's so interesting.
I hope the chair hard. Put it down.
We do have a few minutes if anybody would like to ask any questions. And if you would, just if I could ask you to raise your hand so I can give you the mic. If you could speak into the mic before you ask the question, that'd be really good. Anybody want a question answering?
I don't want any hard ones.
No, that's true. Just a quick one. Was the person we're talking about, Thomas Wentworth, was he the Prime Minister on two occasions?
No, it was his son Charles.
It was Charles.
Charles II Marquis was Prime Minister on two occasions, yes. Yeah.
Right. Cool.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay.
Whereabouts were the almshouses that he was endowing?
They're still there. They're down in the area called Barrow. There's a little toll house, and across from that, there's some brick buildings. The front one at one time was the schoolhouse, and then behind it, in like a quad, are the almshouses, which are still there. There aren't 12 now. They've amalgamated some together, but they're certainly still there, still lived in. And they don't mind you going in and having a look.
Another couple of questions if we have any. I've got one.
I think the chairs are too hard, Steve.
Yeah, you're not wrong. They're not the most comfortable of chairs. I apologise for that.
I need feathers to stuff them a bit more.
One online audience was how much of the Palladian part of the house was finished interior-wise during Thomas's time?
Not all of it. They were certainly doing some of the plaster work, but the second Marquis, Charles, he continued finishing off the interior, certainly. And as you know, later on, when the Fitzwilliams took over, they altered some of the wings, raising them up a story and so on. So the frontage was certainly altered later on, but certainly not all finished at the time of 1750 when he died.
Okay. Any more? Okay.
Thank you. I know you said that he held many titles,
Mm-hmm.
and throughout your presentation, you referred to him purely as the Marquis of Rockingham.
Mm-hmm.
What was his rank in the peerage when the house was actually built?
He had no honours at all when he first started building, but over the years he was made a baron, he was made a viscount, he was made an earl, and eventually the first Marquis of Rockingham just before, 4 years before he died. So he achieved and was given a lot of honours, by the king.
So
but I'm not sure about the hierarchy of them all. Anybody know which is the highest honour? I mean, he was made a knight to start with in 1725.
Duke's that.
Sorry?
Duke.
The Duke is that, yes, I think you're right.
I asked the question because when I looked at you did a bit of a list of his honours, etc.
Yeah.
And from the timeline, it looked like when the house was built, he was the Earl of Malton. And I was just curious.
No, that was a little bit later. When he started, when he was in 1723, when he inherited, he had no titles at all.
No, that's why it was called his honour, wasn't it?
That's right, yes.
His honour is...
His honour was his father, that's right.
The son of a nobleman.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Right,
Okay, I've got time for one more if anybody wants to be brave and ask a question.
So later here,
Nope.
yeah.
Okay.
People are ready to stretch.
Hello, it's about Mary Finch.
Yes.
Talk about the Finch family.
Yes.
Did they have a house in Northamptonshire? And what dowry did she bring to the marriage?
I don't know what dowry she brought, but I mean, obviously it was quite, people were keen to marry into some sort of, with some sort of dowry, but I'm not sure how much she brought. The family had got property in London, Kensington Palace, that sort of region.
But
Her father was a Daniel Finch.
Did they have a house in Northamptonshire?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't know. I'm sorry. Does anybody know whether the Hamptonshire? I wonder how they met, don't you? But don't know. Sorry.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. It has been as informative as I thought I knew it would be. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned so much personally tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Joan Jones, thank you very much.